I really would like to thank Angela and William for being so gracious. It was one of the... I didn't know that aspect of what had happened quite. And, you know, just the grace and generosity with which you treated me was extraordinary. And I hadn't had any experiences of that nature prior in any conference situation. So thank you very, very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Just a little nod to the Muses and Apollo, who are the inspirers of speech, as we know. Sometimes I actually play the music that goes along with this, which is one of the very few extant pieces from Greece that has the lyrics and the music together. And that gives us a sense of how to enter into ancient Greece, but you'll have to hear that music in your head. So this work comes out of my doctoral dissertation at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco, now published in these two books, which some of you have seen upstairs, The Cult of Divine Birth in Ancient Greece and Virgin Mother Goddesses of Antiquity. I'm going to be focusing primarily today on what's in the first one, because in some senses it's the backgrounder, if you will. So I'll talk a little bit about my method in a moment, but just to set the stage here, when we're talking about the idea of virgin birth or divine birth, I realize that a useful way to conceptualize it is to look at it as a siddhi, or a siddhic ability, which in the Buddhist tradition, for example, is a miraculous ability attributed to certain high-level adepts. Things like being able to walk through matter and walls, change your metabolism, live on air, and, you know, or very little, walk through the air miles, you know, essentially levitating, walking on water, all those types of things, including metabolistic changes. And so it occurred to me, well, theoretically, would not giving birth through non-ordinary means or conceiving through non-ordinary means be the ultimate siddhic ability? Yet it's not something that is considered in the siddhic literature, primarily because siddhis are mostly attributed to men. And we are now in the world of women's shamanism, and that is an area that still is being excavated and is still being looked at from women-oriented eyes. And that's how I've gone about looking at some of the ancient Greek material to understand this, and look at it as an actual practice, as I'll be explaining. Where the siddhis for women do fall, as it happens, is at the core of many major religions. So it is there as a siddhic ability, but it has had many veils drawn over it. The primary one being scientism lately, where it's said, well, miraculous conception without male sperm is an impossibility, so we can't really seriously consider any of these things. But then there's another veil that goes over it, which is as an active women's practice. So when the stories come to us, they come to us as stories of women's passive reception of spirits into their body, or their violation. But if we look at some of these traditions, we see that Buddha has a miraculous type of birth story, Zoroaster and Lao Tzu, Sarah, the mother of Isaac, and then, of course, well, the peacemaker in the Iroquois tradition, and, of course, the most famous of all, Mary's virgin conception of Jesus. So these stories are there. We have had to deal with them, and they have been foundational to Western culture, but nobody's quite looked at them from the perspective that I'm looking at them today. What I have done is I have examined Greek texts, Greek histories, accounts of cult, as well as legends and myth. And I've come to the realization that a belief in miraculous birth was at the foundation not only of Greek religion, but also Greek culture and therefore Western civilization as a whole. I am primarily dealing with the Greek tradition in this work, But I will be speaking about ancient Egypt, miraculous birth in ancient Egypt, miraculous birth in ancient Rome, these ideas in Sumer and West Asia, and really they branch out all over, as we just saw in what I showed you previously. But I'm looking primarily today and in my work at ancient Greece, which I think is an important foundation for decoding and then interpreting, reinterpreting many, many other stories, including Mary's conception of Jesus. What I have discovered, and I must say that today I will only be able to give you the broadest outlines of this, of what I've found. I can't really go into some of the details and evidence to the degree that we would all like, because it's extremely plentiful. And so what I would do is refer you to the book. It's heavily, heavily footnoted with direct references from the ancient texts so that people can see where and how I've gotten my material, and I explain where and how and why I'm giving a particular interpretation. And then people can agree or disagree, but at least we'll be on a common ground. So bear with me as I just give you pretty much the broad outlines today. What I have found is that certain colleges of priestesses, virgins, existed in ancient Greece that were dedicated to attempting miraculous birth. In the book, I do not argue whether miraculous birth was ontologically real or not from our contemporary perspective, but of course I have opinions about that, and certainly for this audience I would like to hold open the possibility that this was real. This was a high level of spiritual practice for these women. So essentially, it was the highest level of shamanic practice possible for anyone, being the ultimate Siddhic ability, if you will. And the purpose of it, why miraculous birth? Why get yourself all tangled up in this when sexual intercourse can do just fine? Well, it seems to have been understood that the only way to bring in certain types of daimons, be those hero figures, divine, semi-divine entities, or full-fledged deities, it was thought to be through this what we consider to be a non-ordinary form of conception. So what this is telling us is that these women were involved in an extremely sophisticated form of altered state meditative experience in order to be able to work with their bodies, not only their bodies, but also light and daimons and entities and communicative beings from the other realms. If we just think for a moment about what something like this technically would have involved, it's fairly astounding. So they were giving birth to what I call holy ones. It seems that this practice was part of a whole cycle that the mother would be involved in and then the child would be involved in, that went like this. The priestess would have been trained from an early age, probably 2 or 3 is what I get some evidence for, in temples by other holy virgins. She probably had, and now this I'm very much extrapolating because I don't say this particularly in my book, although I do find lineages of these women, but she probably had history and background in her family, and this was considered a part of a calling for which she had incarnated. She would go through these trainings and then go through a conception ritual, and there were various types of rituals that I discerned over the period of several millennia. And then her child, who in the later period was usually a male, was considered a divine or semi-divine being who upon death would achieve full apotheosis, full divinity. particularly if that child, that being, that individual agreed to undergo a ritual sacrificial murder. And I see numerous stories of this nature in the Greek tradition. For example, Dionysus as one incarnation, Asclepius, there's a story about his death by thunderbolt that suggests ritual sacrificial murder, and others. Heracles, in fact, when he was going to be killed, poisoned by his wife for being unfaithful, he realized, oh gee, I'm dying. I better get on a sacrificial funeral pyre if I wish to ascend to full godhood, and that's exactly what he did. So that's how I read that story. And the priestess then, as a result of achieving this feat of divinely conceiving, upon her death was fully ascended to goddesshood. And thus we have cults to some of these women. Sometimes they are considered nymphs. And I believe that some of the nymph categories of women actually reference historical priestesses who were thought to traverse the realm into divinity, then operate as a divinity with a divinity's intelligence to be able to be supplicated and petitioned and called upon. So that the nymphs, in some sense, or at least some part of the nymphs, could be seen to be the Western equivalent of the Eastern Dakinis. In the Tibetan tradition, we have women like Machi Glaptron and others who traverse the realms, were understood to be part nature, spirit, wild woman, divinity, and part human woman who was a very great, deep spiritual adept. So I think that part of our nymphs are these women. We can understand this idea of the priestess who becomes a deity perhaps a little bit better if we consider the idea of Mary. Mary was a woman who, interestingly, herself was divinely born of her mother Anne, according to the legends, which puts her into a different category, but still she had a human incarnation. And then we are confused, right, as to whether Mary is a woman or a goddess. That is because in this schema of divine birth, she is a woman who became a goddess as a result of doing this. Literally transformed ontological status. And continues to operate now on the astral plane as a female representation of the divine feminine. These are some of the terms that have ambiguous definitions by classicists. They can't quite get a grasp on what these mean. And I contend and explain that they all mean holy priestess of divine birth originally. That's what they meant. And there are some very interesting studies that I do in my first book about that. This question does come up because we are in the realm of what is physically possible. For many of us in this room who are used to the idea of magical practices having reality in the three-dimensional plane, this isn't so far-fetched, but it is worth looking at what's the biochemistry involved. Technically, parthenogenesis, which comes from the Greek parthenos and gignesthai, or to be born of a maiden, more or less, to be born of a virgin, is conception without male sperm. It happens in species all the way from aphids on up the scale into animals. It has been experimentally induced on a number of different types of creatures and animals. And in humans, they've gotten to the point where they have experimentally induced the meiosis of the egg through chemical means. And then the creature, the being, the person-to-be, has grown to the blastula stage, but died in the laboratory, but nobody's put them back into the woman to see what might happen. And there have been other manipulations by which scientists have taken a piece of this and a piece of that and put it together and call it parthenogenesis when it really is not. It's not a natural reproductive process. But Scientifically, were this possible, theoretically, the child would be female.